Hello everyone, welcome back. I thought it'd be good to go back to basics, and we're going to do a series of videos here, and for those of you who are not familiar with photography, and give you some fundamentals to go with and work from there, and eventually, we'll work our way up to more advanced stuff. But today we're going to talk about the exposure triangle. When I first started out in film, I had a Pentax K1000, like I told you, and it actually had a light meter in it. It would measure the light, and it would tell you if you were overexposed or underexposed. And you bought film according to what you were going to shoot. If you slides or prints or whatever, and the film was rated in ISO or ASA. The Americans were the only ones that used ASA, but it was the same as the ISO. And what that stood for is how fast the film was, meaning how long it took the light to expose onto the chemicals on the film to actually expose it. And so the higher the number, the faster the film was. It took less time for the light to be absorbed into the negative. In digital photography, it's based off of the same thing. So ISO 80 is slow, so more light is needed in a longer period of time to actually get light to the sensors. The second thing in the exposure triangle is aperture. Aperture is the opening of the lens. How much light is going through the lens. And I didn't set this thing up for how the numbers would read. Somebody else did, and you might want to research the history of it. But the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. Who knows? So the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. So the bigger the number, the less light is allowed to enter into the front of the lens and expose the film or the sensor behind it. The more light, the larger the opening, the more light is allowed to travel in and get to the sensor. The third item in the exposure triangle is the shutter speed. The shutter speed regulates the time that the film or the sensor in digital cameras is exposed to the light. Okay, so between those three in the exposure triangle gives you the proper exposure, meaning that if you have a higher ISO number, then you can have a smaller aperture or a shorter shutter speed. They all affect each other. Every single one of them affects the other. So if you have slow film and fast aperture with more light coming in, you can use a slower shutter speed. If you have a faster shutter speed, less light, faster film. You see where I'm going here? It's a triangle. They're all interconnected amongst each other. And whether you're shooting film or you're shooting digital, it's the same. Now you may be asking yourself, where did you learn this? I said, well, back in the 80s, I got a book called The Joy of Photography. And the really nice thing about that book is it took you through the fundamentals of taking pictures, of course using film, and explained everything like the exposure triangle. It also took you through and it showed you the different things that happen when you change the different settings, whether the faster the shutter speed is, the more you can freeze action. But at the same time, if your aperture is too small and the ISO is too slow, then you're underexposed. So, it gets kind of complicated, but it's really not that complicated. Now, one of the nice things about today's cameras is you can just throw them into auto mode and it handles all that stuff for you. The disadvantage of that is the fact that you'll never learn how to adjust these things yourself. So what we're going to do over the next few videos is we're going to go through each one of these items and help you better understand how they affect your shot. And this goes for phones today. So let's go back to the aperture and how it affects outcome of your photo. The aperture is like the iris of the pupil in your eye. So the brighter the light, your pupil will shrink down and let less light in, so it's not too bright. The same thing happens with the aperture on a lens. Now, on older lenses, back in the day when I was shooting film, these were all indicated on the lens. You can manually set the aperture. Today, we set the aperture with a dial, and the camera handles what the aperture will be by what setting we select. If we're in a manual mode of some sort, whether it be basically aperture priority. What aperture priority means is I get to set the aperture and it will set the shutter speed accordingly. It will give me the proper shutter speed for the aperture that I have. Now, if I go into shutter priority, I set the shutter and it sets the aperture. Now, you have the ability to shoot auto ISO, so it will automatically adjust the ISO and the other one that you're not controlling. Or you can set the ISO manually. I myself shoot 99.9% of what I shoot is an aperture priority. I set the aperture. The reason I set the aperture is because I want to control the depth of field, which is known as DOF. Remember before I told you acronyms. Everything's got an acronym today. DOF is depth of field. What happens when you narrow down, there's several things that happen when you narrow down the aperture, when you make it smaller. There's diffraction occurs, sharpness deteriorates. Time when you sharpen it down, the depth of field increases. Now, what depth of field is what's in focus in front of and behind the object you're focusing on. So the larger the aperture, the faster, the more light you're letting in, the smaller the depth of field. The lens I'm currently shooting this with is a 1.4. It has a depth of field about this much, at 1.4. If I go to f22, then the depth of field is almost infinite, from right up close to the lens to way away from the lens. You'll find that the sharpest point of your lenses is usually in the middle ground. So this one goes from f1.4 to f16, so somewhere around f5, f7 is where the lens is going to be its absolute sharpest, and that's because of diffraction. Anyway, it gets really deep. If you want to do some research on it and better understand what's going on with diffraction, look it up. Google is your friend. There's a lot of information out there. So let's take a moment to explore what happens when we get too slow of a shutter speed. Now, back in the film days, we had a rule, and like all rules, they're more of guidance than they are an actual rule. But the shutter speed should never be less than what the length of the lens is. So for example, if I'm shooting with a 24 millimeter, I should never let the shutter speed get below 1/24, 1/24 of a second. Rule of thumb, you can get away with a lot of times, but sometimes you can't. If I'm shooting with a 300 millimeter, I shouldn't let the shutter speed get below 300. Not always true, because sometimes you can still have a blurry picture even though your shutter speed was the same length or greater than the length of the lens. It's a rule of thumb. It's a starting point. And a lot of people just don't understand that. It's just a starting point. A lot of people do. I go back to the film days. Now, with digital, the biggest difference you have in digital is it's not costing you anything to take that picture. All right, you can take the picture. In today's cameras, you get instant gratification. You can look at the screen and say, "Oh, I've overexposed. Oh, I'm blurry. Oh, beautiful shot." When I first started out, when we was doing film, you take the picture, and you had to use up the roll of film. Then you took the roll of film and you went to the local drugstore or wherever. You put it in a little packet. You filled the packet out. You dropped it in, and you read up on there how many days before your film would be back. Then your prints or slides, whatever the case may be. And then you come back in a few days and you get your packet and you go over and you pay for it, and you go out into the parking lot and you open it up and you get to see your pictures for the first time, and it's 5 days after you took them. And you're like, well, I wonder what my settings were. How did I screw this one up? Or this is absolutely perfect. Did I write this down so I know how to do this again? Yeah, film days were tough, and it was expensive. Today, you got your initial investment in your camera, your SD card, your lens, and you can shoot over and over and over again. We're going to go into this whole spray and pray scenario later on, but right now, what's important is the fact that where I'm coming from and where I learned, I didn't have the ability to just go out and take a whole bunch of pictures and hope for the best. I had to do my very best to make sure that those images would be worth the money I was spending on a roll of film, processing, development, printing, and my time. Anyway, I hope this has helped you understand the exposure triangle. Now, if you want more details, you can Google it, or you can leave a comment and ask the question down in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer you the best I can. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's helped open your eyes a little bit to what's going on, what these terms mean, and how they affect the image. We're going to continue to go into these, and they're going to get deeper and deeper as we go along, but the goal is to help you understand your camera, your equipment, and the effects that these different settings have on your images. Thank you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and if you find this useful, let your friends know about it. And we'll see you again. Thank you.